For those of you who don't know me, Joe has introduced me, I'm Peter Yu. I'm a Yarra person from Broome in Western Australia, and I'm the current chairman of NAILSMA, the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, which is a mouthful, so you can just say NAILSMA. And I'll introduce our panel members here and allow them to make their presentations, but I might make some introductory remarks first of all. I think I'll leave the matters in terms of NAILSMA's work and where we come from and what we do and what we hope to do to Melissa George. Melissa is, George on my right here, is a Walguru Gubba woman from Magnetic Island, Townsville, in North Queensland. She has worked in Indigenous land and sea management both in Queensland and nationally for over 20 years. She is the current chair of the Federal Environment Minister's Indigenous Advisory Committee and a member of the board of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and the current CEO of NAILSMA. We have also David Morris, who's the principal lawyer at the David to my right, Northern Territory Environmental Defenders Office. The EDO is the Territory's only community legal centre specialising in environmental law. The EDO successfully represented the Environment Centre NT in the NT Supreme Court recently in a challenge about groundwater extraction. And David advises current on issues on mining pollution, water and environmental assessment. Before coming to the NT 2 years ago, David was a corporate lawyer at Maddocks and prosecutor at the Victorian Government Department of Sustainability and Environment. And we've got another David sitting to my left, David Ritter, who's a lawyer and somebody that I met, what must have been about close to nearly 25 years ago. David was the CEO of Yamaji Principal Legal Officer of Yamaji Land and Sea Council, and is now the Executive Director of Greenpeace for Australia and the Pacific. So welcome to our panellists. And we want to be able to, I guess the topic of our discussion, as you've got on your program, is about reflections from these key leaders here about the environment. These are critical matters for Aboriginal people and the nation, and what the future challenges. I think the fundamentally this is an area where it is becoming increasingly critical and important in terms of the relationship. I think we all acknowledge historically there are particular tensions from time to time in terms of the nature of the position of Aboriginal people as native title holders or traditional owners, and that of conservation or environmental kind of groups. I think that there are, from my point of view, I think the starting point, of course, is principally the primary and inherent position of Aboriginal people on their country, and the advent of native title and the confirmation of people's ongoing connection and interest to their lands and to culture and lands and waters and culture and tradition. And the need for the fundamental starting point is the issue, I believe, is the question of pre-FRI and informed consent. And if we're talking about major issues like constitutional reform, which gives recognition to Aboriginal people, then clearly the issue of, there were a number of questions asked in the panel this morning about what the manifestation of that. I think it's worthwhile contemplating the nature of what the future challenges lies ahead or the future relationships might look like in regards to they're critical matters at a local level for traditional owners, they're critical matters for environmentalists, and they're critical matters for the entire nation, really, for us as Australians, about the future of our environment and the future of the natural resource and the maintenance of the credibility and the integrity of the process that we establish to ensure that there is a clear balance juxtaposing those respective interests, because while we might provide the respect for traditional owners, we also appreciate the nature of the inherent concern and genuine concern that environmentalists and other people have to the environment. And I like to think of it as a situation where Aboriginal people as traditional owners of the country, as native title holders of the country, and are the custodians, if you like, of the natural estate, but also custodians of the national estate on behalf of all Australians. I think it's worthwhile to try and investigate and explore how the manifestation or understanding of that might come to bear in the way that we engage, because there will be sensitive issues from time to time. There are critical matters before us about water. In the north, we've had the White Australia paper on northern development. We have heard throughout the Garma events and discussions about the very fragile position in terms of not only the rights, but also the capabilities and structures that aren't in place to be able to ensure that there is the ownership and the capacity of traditional owners and native title owners to be able to not only understand the risks, but also to be able to manage competently the risks that they face on a day-to-day basis, but as they might contribute to sustaining and developing a resilient environment into the future. So these are critical issues facing us, and what we see is a lack of engagement from governments and from policymakers with traditional owners. In fact, we've seen, whether deliberate or by other means a disconnection. I don't think that you can look at the nature of capacity and ability to do things with outside of the broader political or policy environment. The intervention, the IAS process, the whole debate revolving now around about the viability of remote communities. These factors contribute to an ability to respond appropriately with some degree of competence and capability to deal with these critical kind of issues. And they're front and centre of the concern and interest of traditional owners and native title holders right across the north of Australia, and of course the rest of Australia as well too. So we're kind of faced, I guess if we were to kind of just put a challenge out there looking at what might be contemplated as a result of the release of the white paper and its northern development. First of all, there is no formal engagement strategy with governments from traditional owner interests, other than what you've heard the bodies like the Advisory Committee, National Advisory Committee. But in terms of the specific areas and of how do we engage, what is the protocol for that engagement, what are the key issues that need to be identified that are going to be risk issues, and what is our approach in terms of mitigation of those issues into the future. So the government's asking, we're talking about a significant impact on water. The whole issue of fracking is front and centre publicly, of concern to people all around the country. How do you juxtapose the nature of emerging prescribed body corporates after native title determinations and people wanting to identify some ability to generate their own income and revenue independent of government so they can facilitate development on their lands? These are very difficult questions to be able to answer. But I'm not going to try and give you those answers here. My job really is just to allow our invited guests here speaking today to give us a bit of insight in their reflections. So I might, I think the two gentlemen might mind if I invite, first of all, my colleague Melissa George to the... Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter. And firstly, before I talk, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and thanking them for allowing me to talk here today. Like as Peter sort of said in his, has said, I've been sort of in the game of environmental management and Indigenous land and sea management, particularly for around 20 years now. And I suppose we're always, as Indigenous people, engaged in this business, chasing our tails. Ultimately, we can go back to the days of the CDP program when it existed and the abolition of that, and this whole idea that we had all of these people who were on country essentially getting paid work for the dole to look after matters of national environmental significance. And the idea at that point was, well, what's now going to happen with this active workforce that's out there doing a job within the national interest. So back then, Joe Morrison was a member of the Indigenous Advisory Committee, and I remember us having the conversation with the then Parsec, who's now the Minister, Greg Hunt, around, well, what do we do with these people and what's going to happen to country if those individuals aren't there to manage it? So from that point, there was a bit of a struggle to get the Working on Country program initiated, and obviously that's been around for some time now. Its investment is something to the tune of close to $400 million for the whole program. It employs over 700 people nationally. We also have a program called the Indigenous Protected Area, which is a program, but ultimately it's about mob on country, looking after those areas, places that are significant and important to them. And, you know, the IPA program, when you talk about the National Environmental Estate, makes up 20% of it. Actually makes up 48% of it, and 20% of, as we know, of Australia's land mass is under Indigenous control and ownership. So I think, you know, one of the things that we're facing now, given the current political and policy climate, is that there's been no clear determination made around what happens to those two very significant areas of work beyond 2018. So from my perspective as the new CEO of NAILSMA, we have a lot of work to do to ensure that from a policy and a program perspective that, you know, the government is listening to us, and I can say from my perspective that's not happening at the moment. We have a minister who thinks that he owns ranges, that he owns IPAs. That's not the case. I don't know anyone who owns an individual who lives on any part of Australia. So I think from, you know, personally from my perspective, we've got a long way to go in this whole conversation around how we actually keep people on country and active participants in looking after it. Not only around, you know, questions of, you know, that whole thing about employment, health, etc., but how do we ensure cultural sustainability and longevity? How do we ensure that young people have a place and a role to play on country into the future? And I think that, you know, we have a lot of people out there, and, you know, I think Arnhem Land is a perfect example. We have a huge amount of ranges, we have a huge amount of Indigenous protected areas, and we need to kind of work out how we can continue to support them into the future. And I think one of the issues that always concerns me is when we talk about the environment, it sort of ends up in this little box. And when you're dealing with Aboriginal people and the environment, it's only around conservation. I think we need to be really clear that we've got to start viewing the way that people exist with their country is more than conservation. People need to be supported to make active decisions, and they need to be afforded to be participants in the future development of their country. Whether that's a mine, whether that's undertaking pastoralism, whether that's actually undertaking ecosystem services more broadly. And I think, as you know, Joe said on Saturday, there needs to be a place at the table for Aboriginal people in the planning process. And unfortunately, that's not happening. And if we don't get that right from an environmental perspective or from a whole of country perspective, we can be guaranteed that, you know, country's not going to be safe or protected into the long term. As Peter said, you know, there's a lot of business that NAILSMA's undertaken over the last decade. I'm very proud to be the new CEO of that organisation. It has a very good track record with people on country across the north. One of the, I think, the most significant parts of work that NAILSMA's undertaken is back in the early days of the carbon farming initiative, and working with traditional owners and scientists to actually determine and underpin the savanna burning methodology. So the savanna burning methodology is essentially those areas where there's over 1,000 mil of rainfall per annum. Now, through the initial work that NAILSMA has done, I think to date there's been around $22 million earned by traditional owners on country burning. And that's obviously a very significant investment, and it's an investment that can move people away from government investment to being independent and sustainable. And I think that, you know, if we can keep working with communities to develop their capability to get engaged in carbon farming, that's a really important thing to do. But there's also the broader ecosystem services framework which we need to support traditional owners to get engaged in. So whether that's around, you know, diversification of marginal pastoral properties, whether that's around management of offsets through broad developments that take place. And I think probably David will give you a bit more of the legal side. I'm a bit of a nerd. I love the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. I've been working in it for about 15 years. But, you know, although that piece of legislation determines and says quite clearly that the rights, the use of biodiversity and the knowledge of biodiversity by Indigenous peoples should be upheld and protected. The proof being in the pudding is that the reality is it's not. We have a recent process that's taken place called the one-stop shop mechanism, where each state and territory now has the responsibility to assess environmental approvals, assess developments and therefore approve those developments. So the role of Indigenous people within that framework has been completely sidelined once again. The onus is on the government to make a fair decision around whether a matter of national environmental significance is being impacted on, so that's threatened species, Ramsar areas, etc. And the role of Aboriginal people within that process is now completely outside, and it's going to be a massive issue as we move into the Northern Development Agenda. The rhetoric obviously is always there, but we feel that there's a lot of malice in the rollout and the implementation of that process. And I probably can move on now.
Okay. Can I talk to this mic? Great, thanks. Well, I might just invite, would you mind going next, David?
Sure. I'd been happily relaxing, assuming you're going to move from that side, but I'll do relax. Look, I want to also thank and acknowledge the Gumatj people for having us on their country, and to the Yothu Yindi Foundation for the invitation to be on a panel. But actually my thanks need to kind of go beyond that. Peter, I was thinking about it, and I think it's actually 20 years ago this month that I met you for the first time up in Broome. And you were then, as you are now, good-natured and courteous enough to put out your hand and smile, despite the fact that I was a very green lawyer coming up from Perth who'd never, I think, been further north than Geraldton, and let me tell you, that's not very far north. And that was really the first step for me in a journey of learning and of listening. And I'd like to acknowledge the moral and intellectual tutelage that I am a beneficiary of. And that's a moral and intellectual tutelage that you saw on display this morning. That was a panel of great thinkers and scholars. They happen to be Indigenous as well, but I'm a beneficiary of that contribution to the national debate, to the public debate, to the common good, and I would like to acknowledge that. And I suppose coming from a background of working for Indigenous people, I worked for an Aboriginal organisation, the longest professional job I've had. Yamaji Mulba Land and Sea Council, Native Title Representative Body Inc. It was a very cluttered business card. And coming from that role, across from having been a servant of Native Title claimant groups and a servant of an Indigenous board and CEO, to then move into Greenpeace first in the UK and then as CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific has meant that I've been on a trajectory into that work. And I think it's been a very helpful trajectory for me, because one of the things I learned through that process of engaging with Aboriginal people was that when you're at law school, you learn about the law. And when you have Indigenous clients who've faced 200 plus years of oppression, you learn about power. And you learn that power and the face of the law are quite different things. And working for Greenpeace, what Greenpeace does as an organisation is globally we say, well, what are the greatest threats to, and if I quote Noel Pearson from 2 days ago, what are the greatest threats to the opportunity for us to last long upon the earth? So Greenpeace says, well, what are the greatest threats to us lasting long upon the earth? Or in our internal mission statement, securing an earth capable of nurturing life in all its diversity. Well, those threats are climate change, deforestation, destruction of the world's fish stocks. I know I'm getting into the nightmare territory that Kumi warned against the other day, but we'll do some optimistic things as well. So you say, well, what are the threats? Then you say, well, what are the solutions to all of those things? Because we have the solutions. So what is getting in the way between the threats and the solutions? And some of those solutions, as we've just heard, are solutions that are about participation and are about empowerment and are about deeper democracy, and others are technical and are about the way we structure our economic systems. But we have those solutions. So what's the bit in the middle? Well, the bit in the middle is maladjusted power. It's vested interests having too much control over our democracy, over our resources. And so where Greenpeace fits in is to try and shift power, is to try and take on the vested interests. And so as a tuition in having that sense of there being a fundamental need to take on maladjusted power and to try to shift it, there could have been no better training ground for me than working with Indigenous Australia and gaining that instruction from the historical and contemporary experience of Indigenous Australia. Now, as a global leader, Kumi Naidoo mentioned when he talked a couple of days ago, and Kumi, who has left this morning but came here with me on Friday, and he's left this morning because he's gone off to go and see the Great Barrier Reef with some people there. As Kumi reflected, this is such an important occasion for us as representatives of Greenpeace, because it's part of an organisational journey for Greenpeace. Because there's no question that we've made mistakes in our dealings with Indigenous people. We made mistakes, particularly in our dealings with Indigenous people in Canada and in the Arctic Circle. We are, I think, going back a number of decades for those historic mistakes, but they are there, and we must continue to reflect upon them, and we must continue to subject what we do to critical appraisal. And so in Canada, in the US, we've taken very concrete steps. In Russia, we've taken very concrete steps. And in Greenpeace Australia Pacific, where I think by and large our relationships have stayed very strong. We've had, for example, the work we've done with traditional owners around forest preservation in Papua New Guinea, the work we have done with small island nations both on climate justice and on protecting the plunder of Pacific fish stocks from deep water fishing fleets. I think by and large there's a lot of good things. There are some good stories to tell there. But it is important that these things be formalised, and it is important that we deepen what we do. So the principal reason to come to Garma is to listen and to learn and to spend time, but we also wanted to come with an offering. And the offering is the policy that I'm taking to the Greenpeace Australia Pacific Board later this week, but which Kumi put out here a couple of days ago so people could come up and make comments about what it contained. And that's a policy which I hope is the best in the world in terms of the strength of the commitment that it makes to Indigenous peoples within the Australia Pacific remit. Because it makes the commitment that Greenpeace Australia Pacific acknowledges the authority of traditional, contemporary, and in fact all layers of Indigenous decision-making structure, that it acknowledges the necessity of free, prior and informed consent as a principle enshrined by the United Nations, that it acknowledges, of course, the rights for traditional use of traditional country, but it also acknowledges absolutely the right to contemporary economic development and full participation in economic life. That all of those things are acknowledged, and they are acknowledged in the spirit of great hopefulness, that there is so much more that unites us, I believe, in a common struggle, in the desire that peoples may, to use Noel's words, last long upon the earth. So it's an offering that's made in a spirit of great hopefulness and deep ambition. But it does also acknowledge, and it would be foolish to not acknowledge, that there are times when there may be differences. And in part, those differences are a product of the unjust nature of the legal system that we have, that places Indigenous people in a position where there is no right of veto, where the only ability you have so often under Australian native title laws, for example, is to make a deal or get nothing. So to acknowledge the truth that there will be times when there will be differences, but to say that even when there are those differences, that we as Greenpeace must proceed respectfully, in good faith, listening always, talking straight. And so that even at moments of legitimate difference of view, that Greenpeace will conduct ourselves well, that we will conduct ourselves with honour. That is the nature of the offering. The last thing I want to say before finishing is there are, I think, 82 people who have been good enough to come in to our final session on the final day, and that alone is enough to give me a sense of hope. Thanks for coming along. Thanks,
Thanks very much, David. I might move on straight away to David Morris and give him the opportunity to say that I don't know whether or not there are any questions, so we might allow some time after that to before we close up, but I invite David.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. And I would too like to acknowledge the Gumatj people. Thank you for sharing this wonderful experience with us, and thank you to the Yothu Yindi Foundation for inviting me as the sole lawyer at the Environmental Defender's Office in the Northern Territory to come and speak to you today. David spoke about being a very new and very green lawyer when he went to work for an Aboriginal body some 20 years ago, and I can see some of myself in that. It's been a very steep learning curve for me over the past 2 years or so that I've been the head of the Environmental Defender's Office in the Northern Territory. I don't think I'd been any further north than the Gold Coast, and I'd certainly never been to the Northern Territory. It's been probably, or without doubt, the greatest privilege and the greatest learning experience I've had coming to the Northern Territory, working with Aboriginal people as clients. And I have a terrific role and function, I think, in that I'm there to help facilitate free, prior and informed consent. And it's been very obvious to me that there is a very big gulf between what government thinks it's achieving in terms of consultation with Aboriginal people and what Aboriginal people feel like they are getting by way of consultation. And probably the best example that I can think of in my time in the Northern Territory has been the way that the Aboriginal community of Borroloola and the area that surrounds it in relation to the MacArthur River mine, which is run by Glencore. They have an independent monitor requirement in their permit conditions, which requires independent scientists to do testing on the environmental impacts of that particular minerals extraction development. And last year in October, I was in Borroloola when the independent monitor released its report. It was an incredibly complex document, and I've got an environmental science degree, and I could not understand what the scientists presenting that document were saying. And the people that I was there with and asked to go and listen and learn from the scientists about speak Garawa, speak Yanyuwa. English is not their first language, and they're being spoken to in English science language, which is incomprehensible. That is just a one pertinent example I've seen of where government said, hey, this is how we're engaging the community, to explain to them what the impact of this resource development has been on their particular country and land. And it got me thinking over the course of the last few days, talking about empowerment and reading an article that Peter wrote some years ago about the power of data in Aboriginal hands, one of the most constant requests I've had has been to make freedom of information requests of government so that Aboriginal people can understand what the data is saying about a particular development on their country, which is not being given to them by government or by industry. And Peter's article was talking, I think, about demographic information and things like that, but I think the same power is given to Aboriginal people if they are put in charge of collection, use and interrogation of data in relation to environmental matters on their country too. The other aspect of it that I would like to speak about is that at the moment it seems to me that the government's idea of economic development, and I know it's not in isolation, but the Northern Territory government's idea of economic development seems to be very, very heavily focused on the extraction of the 200 trillion cubic feet of gas that we apparently have in the Northern Territory. And that changes to the law, getting rid of things like carbon farming or altering the legal framework in which that occurs, taking away incentives for other kinds of renewable development by reducing the renewable energy target, influence options that Aboriginal people have on their country. Because at the moment, what I hear and what I see is, would you like a gas development on your country? And if it's native title, you've got 6 months to negotiate that agreement. So I've been very fortunate. I went down to it was a small community outside of Uluru to attend a Central Land Council full council meeting, and they invited me and a number of other representatives from industry and government to come and talk to the traditional owners of those wide range of areas that encompass the Central Land Council's jurisdiction to talk about fracking. And that was a really wonderful example of that Land Council saying, we want to furnish the people that we represent with a really full picture. And it wasn't just environmentalists, it wasn't just industry, it wasn't just government, it was all of us there, and it was a really, really fulsome debate. And I think when you're presented with that full spectrum of ideas, it really does go a long way to you being able to form your own view about how you feel about a particular development. The final thing that I would say, and it's from a local perspective, is that we have really terrible environmental protection laws in the Northern Territory. And that places an enormous burden on Aboriginal people and I think on land councils to make sure that they put those environmental protection mechanisms into their agreements. But off Aboriginal land and off native title land, so some pastoral leases, for example, where you've still got extensive sacred sites, you've still got extensive areas of cultural significance, you've got very little protection there under our 6-page Environmental Assessment Act. We've got a major port development occurring on the Tiwi Islands right now, which hasn't been assessed under Northern Territory legislation and may not yet be assessed under Commonwealth legislation. And I think that puts a real burden on Aboriginal people. That's certainly been my experience talking to my Aboriginal clients. So I think that's all I'll say by way of introduction and hopefully questions from the floor. Peter, go.
Thanks, David and Davida and Melissa. So I'm happy to take. We might have about 5 or 10 minutes of questions, but before I do, can I just point out a couple of publications here at the front of the stage. The NAILSMA publications. It's quite a useful. This larger one is about Indigenous fire management and carbon farming. And I do this because I think it really is instructive and what, in terms of the potential it offers in respect to the engagement of traditional land rangers and land and sea managers across Northern Australia and their contribution not only in terms of looking after their own country but in terms of looking after the national state. So it tells you what carbon farming is, if those of you who aren't familiar with it, and its values and its impact, and how relates to its contribution to offsetting carbon in relation to greenhouse gas impact. And there's a further publication, which I think it's actually for sale, which is about what, I'm not sure how much it is, $40, which is, it's the eye tracker book called Looking After Country, and the eye tracker is a technology and cyber technology that we've been able to employ at ranger groups right across northern Australia in terms of data collection, in regards to fire management, in regards to biodiversity management, in regards to a whole range of other land and sea management work on country, which was launched by the Federal Minister in the World Park Congress in November last year. But they would give you, I think, greater insight in terms of some of the very important and crucial work that's happening. So if you're interested, they're just down here. Maybe you can see one of the staff members, Bentley, sitting there. Is that all right? Bentley sitting there. Yeah, great. Thank you, Bentley. Now, I'll open it up for questions. I think they were a very useful discussion and perspective from 3 different people. So, yes.
My name is Sarah Martin.
Okay, we've got a microphone here. Yes, if you wouldn't mind just saying that'd be good. Thank you. And who you're directing your question to?
Actually, I haven't got a question, but I would like to add another dimension to what's being discussed here. My name's Sarah Martin, and I'm writing the history of a philanthropic organisation called Bush Heritage Australia. And I would just like to point out, or I mean, I'm sure you all know about all these organisations who are seriously trying to make a difference from a philanthropic angle. You've got the Pew Foundation, you've got the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, you've got the Nature Conservancy and Bush Heritage, among several others, who are working in this area. And from my exploration of the history of Bush Heritage, they started by buying properties and looking after the conservation, but they have grown, as has other organisations, into the idea that they must work with all the stakeholders of areas. They're very intent on preserving large landscapes, huge landscapes, because they believe that that's the only way we can buffer against climate change and things like that. And in the up here in the Northern Territory, they don't buy property, but they wait to be invited by traditional owners to come on land and support and help with what they might need, the scientific or the financial support. And they believe now that they must work under the guidance of the Aboriginal groups. And what I really want to say is that I am discovering that there's a huge philanthropic interest by many Australians in supporting Aboriginal people, traditional owners on their land, and I think it's got to be tapped more than it is. And I think from my observation and what I've been learning as I've come up here is that we're leaving, white Australia is leaving a huge, as you mentioned, huge responsibility on Aboriginal people to look after what we as Australians want to preserve, our natural heritage and our great estate that is completely unique in the world, and we will really suffer if it falls apart. And we've got to tap that philanthropic spirit within the Australian population.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I think what you've raised is a very critical kind of factor, and I know that there are discussions happening and there are people wanting to do it. I think that's there is a bit of a gap, and it's good to hear you say that there is an increasing interest in the philanthropic sector. I think the challenge or the issues would be in terms of navigating or negotiating the kind of the balance of the Indigenous kind of interest in respect to that type of investment, and ensuring that there is the proper governance framework. Because one of the difficulties I think we do have at the moment is that there is a degree of competition, particularly from in the research area and from academic institutions, that we have a lot of traditional owners saying to us, and the relevancy of their research, I think, is a critical factor as well too. Yeah. We have a lot of community members saying to us, you know, who's this, what are they doing, and why are they doing that, and it's a bit disjointed. I think the critically important is the kind of cohesiveness or the collaboration, if you want, giving that greater definition as to how that might happen going into the future.
That's what I've discovered, that there's just too much everywhere of little pockets of information.
Thanks. And I'll let Melissa respond to that as well.
David made a statement, David Ritter, before about this power of vested interests and the third-party vested interests. Now, experience, I suppose, from my perspective in the north, is that conservation NGOs have been one of those power areas, power organisations and vested interests. I think an example from where I live, from well, actually probably across the north, we have some of the organisations that you've mentioned who, and I think the Wild Rivers legislation in Cape York is a perfect example of a conservation NGO doing a backdoor deal with a government to essentially enact a piece of legislation without any consultation with traditional owners. Now, this piece of legislation not only led to division between Aboriginal people and conservationists, but it also created a massive amount of division between Aboriginal people, either in the Cape or within the Gulf of Carpentaria.
I understand.
So, as one example, and we have other, major conservation NGOs who have received government funding as well as private funding to buy large properties, who essentially build fences and lock blackfellas out. Yep. So not only do they have a bad relationship with their neighbours like pastoralists, etc., but they refuse to come to the table and work collaboratively with Aboriginal people. So, but then on the other hand, you have organisations like Bush Heritage and the Nature Conservancy who have been making a concerted effort to work with Aboriginal people. But I think we need to recognise that we've got to get to a point where it's got to be about what Aboriginal people want to do on their country, not what conservation NGOs expect them to do because they bring the donor dollar. Yeah. So we're sort of, NAILSMA's currently, and we've been had a long-term relationship with the Nature Conservancy. We're dealing with that same issue again. Who makes the decisions around how this philanthropic money operates at a community level? It's not up to NAILSMA as an organisation to say, this is what you do with this money. And mind you, we've got a direct relationship with the individual who's giving the money. It's not up to the conservation NGO to determine how the money is spent. And I think that goes back to the point around people being engaged in the development of the process, sitting at the table in the planning of the projects, and more importantly, having a proper say around how that's going to operate on their estate and what benefit it's going to bring to them. Because if we don't start doing that, you can have as much philanthropy coming into Aboriginal lands as you want, and unless people are at the front of making decisions around where the investment goes, how it's spent, and what the opportunity is, I think we're at a failed game. And look, I agree with you. People in the southern part of the country need to kind of start being educated around what Aboriginal people are doing for the benefit of the national interest. Yep. Because there's this idea, I think Pew undertook a survey a couple of years ago around, what do people know about ranges? The majority, 90% of participants in that survey had no idea about the work that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do within the national interest. And I think if there's one thing that people who are at this session when they go home is to try and generate this idea around, well, how do we actually educate the broader community around what people do? Because unless we do that, we're not going to, the mums and dads who contribute $5 to organisations like the Wilderness Society are not going to understand. And we need to be really clear about what these conservation NGOs do to impact on the lives of Aboriginal people, the good and the bad.
Yeah. And that's what I'm going to try and do in my book.
Okay.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you. I might hand over to David Ritter to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So look, when I refer to vested interests, specifically what I'm referring to are organisations that are motivated by commercial gain. But that's not to in any way try and hide the fact that organisations that have particular mandates or particular missions in the world also try and do what they're set up to do. I do think there is a significant issue around independence of organisations. One of the things I love about working for Greenpeace is we take no money from any government. We take no money from any business. We never have. We've been around for 40 years, and we don't anywhere in the world. It's as sacrosanct as the principle of non-violence for us. I think also we are in a slightly different position because Greenpeace doesn't do program delivery or area conservation. So the nature of the work that we're involved with is about campaigning to shift power. So it's not that that is without dilemmas, but they're a different set of dilemmas. And I mean, broadly, I guess we think of ourselves as an environmental justice organisation. So there are, I guess, to our way of thinking, there are no sustainability outcomes that do not simultaneously empower Indigenous people. It would simply be, it would be false and it would be wrong. And it would not only be false and it would be wrong because it would be inconsistent with the set of values that underpins the organisation, but because we know from study after study after study that if you actually want to look after the country successfully, that can only be done by giving power to the people who own and are on the country. So, look, I'll simply do and agree with that. And where I agree with David Morris very strongly is that where the only economic possibility being presented is a carbon-based economic possibility, it's essentially the selling of the next lie, because the world is and must move away from fossil fuels. And when I hear that a government is saying the only way for Indigenous people is yet more exploitation of fossil fuels, I know that a lie is being told, the latest lie by government to Indigenous people in Australia, but also that there must be real economic alternatives. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, David. I might just take one more over here and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Greg Wern, have done some work and do some work around here with Dimmeril. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the work of NAILSMA and congratulate NAILSMA over the years for the contribution that they have made. I think as an organisation they are indeed an unsung hero. And I would also just like to underline the extent of the challenge that I think confronts the environmental movement, Indigenous environmental movement, in terms of maintaining the wonderful gains that have been made in the rollout of a range of programs, and not just that, but the work that's been done by all sorts of organisations collaborating together. It's been an exceedingly positive period, but if we're not careful, we may well lose it. So we've all got to work together in whatever way we can to make sure that we keep moving forward.
Thanks very much. Okay, my final task, a very difficult one, is to channel Andrea Collins with some final comments and something that she's provided me with. So, and I hope I can do it justice. Noah's Ark, if it happened today. And God spoke to Noah and said, "In 6 months I'm going to make it rain until the whole of earth is covered with water and all the evil people are destroyed. But I want to save a few good people and 2 of every kind living on the planet. So I'm commanding you to build an ark." And in a flash of lightning, God delivered the specifications for an ark. "Okay," said Noah, trembling with fear and fumbling with the blueprints. 6 months and it starts to rain, thundered the Lord. "You'd better have the ark completed or learn to swim for a very long time." 6 months passed, the skies clouded up and rain began to fall. The Lord saw that Noah was sitting in his front yard weeping, and there was no ark. "Noah," shouted the Lord, "where is the ark?" "Lord, please forgive me," begged Noah. "I did my best, but there was big problems. First I had to get a building permit for the ark and for the construction project, and your plans didn't meet the code. So I had to hire an engineer to redraw the plans. Then I got into a big fight over whether or not the ark needed a fire sprinkler system. Then my neighbour objected, claiming I was violating zoning by building the ark in my front yard. So I had to get a variance from the City Planning Commission. Then I had the problems getting enough wood for the ark because there was a ban on cutting trees to save the spotted owl. I had to convince the Park and Wildlife Department that I need the wood to save the owls, but they wouldn't let me catch any owls, so no owls. The carpenters formed a union and went on strike. I had to negotiate a settlement with the National Workers' Union before anyone would pick up a saw or hammer. Now we have 16 carpenters going on the boat and still no owls. Then I started gathering up animals and they got sued by the animal rights group. They objected to me taking only 2 of each kind. Just when I got the suit dismissed, Environmental Protection Agency notified me that I couldn't complete the ark without filing an environmental impact statement on your proposed flood. They didn't take kindly to the idea that they had no jurisdiction over the conduct of a supreme being. Then the Army Corps of Engineers wanted a map of the proposed new floodplain. I sent them a globe. Right now, I'm still trying to resolve a complaint from the Equal Opportunities Commission about how many disabled people with disabilities I'm supposed to hire. The IRS has seized all my assets, claiming I'm trying to avoid paying taxes by leaving the country. And I just got notice from the state about owing them some kind of used tax. The Sex Discrimination Board are questioning why gays and lesbians can't include it. I really don't think I can finish the ark for at least another 5 years, Noah wailed. The sky began to clear. The sun began to shine. A rainbow arced across the sky. Noah looked up and smiled. You mean you're not going to destroy the earth? Noah asked hopefully. No, said the Lord sadly. The government already has. Thank you very much to our speakers for taking part today, and thank you for coming along. Have a safe journey home.